Thank you so much. So if you have questions, I will also like to invite you to share them in the chat. We will be collecting them throughout the webinar, and we will try to address a few at the end of today's event. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So as you can see, we have a very full agenda for today. After a quick overview of the indicator, my colleagues will share with you a bit about the developmental domains that provide guidance on how to go about tool selection for this indicator. We will then go into the disaggregates, and we will discuss some of the requirements linked to ES 1.1-1. And then thankfully, we have some time for Q&As, but again, please do include your questions in the chat, and we hope that we have enough time at the end to address some of your questions. And now, without much further ado, I will hand it over to Melissa Cipilli, Deputy Director Technical at USAID Center for Education, for opening remarks. Melissa?
Thank you, Cassandra. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone. Many thanks for joining us today as we introduce USAID's new outcome indicator for pre-primary education, ES 1.1-1, or Average Early Learning Skills Score for Pre-Primary Learners Targeted for U.S. Government Assistance. Since the launch of the USAID 2018 education policy, the agency has increasingly looked at pre-primary education as a way to achieve objectives in foundational skills. Research shows that investments in high-quality pre-primary education contribute to significant learning gains in early primary school and can help close the skills gaps in reading and math between children from disadvantaged backgrounds and their peers from more advantaged and well-resourced backgrounds. Children who gain foundational skills in pre-primary have an increased likelihood of achieving grade-level proficiency later in school. They also have a decreased likelihood of dropping out and are more likely to complete primary school and continue to higher levels of education. Investments in this area also contribute to the overall efficiency of education systems. Increasing access to high-quality pre-primary education decreases underage and overage enrollment in primary schools, as well as repetition rates in early primary grades, and in many cases decreases the size of first-grade classrooms. We also know that the benefits of high-quality pre-primary education go beyond the education sector. Children who access high-quality pre-primary services attain higher levels of income generation over their lifetimes. The launch of ES 1.1-1 is a significant step to demonstrate the impact USAID is having in the pre-primary space, as it is the first time the agency has released a learning outcomes indicator at the pre-primary level. This will allow USAID to measure and report on learning outcomes for young learners. It also provides the agency with an opportunity to further contribute to the global evidence in early learning. Our hope is that this new indicator is included in USAID-funded pre-primary education activities. It will help the agency call attention to the progress and gaps in global investments in pre-primary education. Thanks again for your participation today, and I'll hand it back to Cassandra. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa. That was a great framing for today's presentation. Just before we start, I also wanted to invite you again to share your questions, observations, and comments in the chat. While we might not be able to address all your questions today, we will be collecting them as your questions, observation, and comments will help us develop a few guidance documents that we are in progress developing for the use of this new indicator. Now to ask for the poll to be launched. Wonderful. So now you should see a question on your screen. And yes, we have questions for you. And the question is, in how many countries do you think USAID is implementing pre-primary education? Please select one of the answers: less than 10, 10 to 20, 21 to 30, more than 30. Again, the question is, in how many countries do you think USAID is implementing pre-primary education? Okay, let's see if we can see some of the responses coming in. No pressure. The responses are anonymous, so no worries. All right, so I see here your responses. Thank you very much. Next slide. And this is the answer. So in fiscal year 2022, which is providing us with the most recent data available, USAID partners help advance pre-primary education in 31 countries, of which 11 are experiencing crisis and conflict. And 4 USAID operating units, which include missions, reported efforts in providing pre-primary education to children with disabilities. And in the same time period, we know that USAID reached 1.2 pre-primary learners and helps train more than 11,000 educators. So pre-primary education is still a newer areas of emphasis for the agency, but we also know that since fiscal year 2022, the numbers might have changed slightly thanks to new procurements and new activities. But the numbers that you see here on the slide still provide a good representation of USAID portfolio in the pre-primary space. What these numbers tell us is that we have a good understanding of how many children we are reaching. The question that remains, though, is with what impact? And we know and we hope that ES 1.1-1 will help us uncover some of the contribution that USAID is having in improving early developmental learning skills for young children globally. Okay, so just to give you some information about the new indicator, ES 1.1-1, which you see here on the slide, was originally developed and made available to USAID operating units, including missions, a few years ago. After rounds of internal and external consultation, ES 1.1-1, or Average Early Learning Skills Score for pre-primary learners targeted for USG assistance, was included among standard indicators. It joins an existing pre-primary indicator, which you see on the left of your screen, ES 1.53, which has been providing us information on the number of learners that USAID funded activities have reached. Just an information for those of you who have been using the supplemental indicators that ES 1.1-1 replaced. If you have been using these supplemental indicators, please make plans to transition to the new standard indicator, ES 1.1-1. So before I hand it over to Anne and Suzanne, so they can walk us through the performance indicator reference sheet, I wanted to spend a few moments describing the rationale and the scope of the indicator. So the why and why does ES 1.1-1 look the way it does. So ES 1.1-1 is in service of programming that advance basic education priorities. And as you know, all USAID funded education activities, including those at the pre-primary level, must measure learning outcomes. And the reason is because in response to the READ Act, the USAID 2018 education policy prioritizes sustained, measurable improvement in learning outcomes and skills development, so including at the pre-primary level. So the new indicator that we're presenting today is providing both USAID operating units and implementing partners a pathway for addressing this policy requirement. We discussed that the indicator priority purpose is measurement and also to illustrate what foreign assistance can accomplish in the pre-primary space, and also for reporting back to Congress. At the same time, though, we need an indicator that could be used in different countries and across very different contexts. So that includes contexts where perhaps pre-primary education is just a new nascent subsector, as well as in contexts where there might be already national benchmarks. We also needed for this indicator to be able to be used to report on learning for all learners, independently on whether or not a child is developmentally on track, which is a term that everyone working on ECD is very familiar with. And this need is really in alignment with our efforts as an agency to support early learning for all children, including those with disabilities, as well as those living in context of crisis and conflict. For us, ES 1.1-1 is a starting point for measuring pre-primary learning outcomes, on which then more nuanced and contextualized learning can be built. And lastly, But very importantly, as Melissa also pointed out, this is the first time that the agency will be able to report on investments in early learning through a standard indicator for the pre-primary level. It's very exciting, at least for us, and I think for everyone on this call. And by collecting data on early development and learning outcomes, the agency and its operating units and implementing partners can further contribute to evidence building in early learning, both at the local and the global level. We believe that through the measurement requirements that have been established for this new indicator ES 1.1-1, USAID will be able to collect data that can then be used to report against global reporting mechanisms, including the Sustainable Development Goal Target 4.2, just a reminder that help us work towards ensuring that by 2030, all girls and boys have access to quality early childhood development, care, and pre-primary education so they can be then ready for primary education. We really hope that by being able to report on the agency investments in the early learning space, we're also able to continue to advocate globally for quality early child education. Now I will hand it over to Anne. Anne is a monitoring and evaluation learning specialist at USAID Center for Education. She will walk us through the domains of early learning and how they inform the choice of assessment tool. Anne?
Thank you, Cassandra. Appreciate that great introduction, and it's really wonderful to be with you all here today. I'm going to talk about the meat of the indicator. So what are we assessing and how are we assessing? If we can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so first, what are we assessing? The USAID education policy describes early learning skills by identifying 4 domains, which are here on the screen for you. These are defined as language and emergent literacy, which includes the wide body of skills that support children to learn through oral, written, and sign language-based communications. These include broadly listening and speaking, nonverbal communication, including sign languages, receptive and expressive storytelling and conversation, and concepts of print, phonological awareness, phonemic awareness, alphabetic awareness, and comprehension of text. Next, we have emergent numeracy, which refers to the knowledge and skills that support effective learning and application of mathematics. These include number sense, spatial awareness, and geometry, the ability to sort and classify, following patterns and seriation and simple mathematics operations. Next, we have social emotional learning, or SEL, which includes the skills necessary to support children's ability to adapt to and thrive in the classroom social environment, including but not limited to forming positive relationships with peers and adults, the ability to work and play in a group, thinking and acting independently, solving conflicts, managing relationships, identifying, expressing, and regulating emotions, exhibiting self-esteem, and showing respect towards others. And then finally, we have a 4th domain of physical development, which refers to a child's large motor development, including the ability to sit, stand, and walk, as well as fine motor development, which includes the ability to hold a pencil and grasp with 2 fingers, for example. So the implementation guidance for the USAID education policy states that all programs at the pre-primary level should take a holistic approach to measurably improve learning and education in at least 3 of these 4 domains. So the ES 1.1-1 peers aligns with this guidance. While the assessment tools might vary in terms of the domains that are included, and the definition of those terms, all activities should target and measure at least 3 of these domains to be counted under the indicator. And again, although activities may address additional domains in their programming, reporting for this indicator should not include those additional domains, but that can definitely still be part of whatever activities are planned if that is contextually relevant. So how do we actually measure these domains? We'll talk about the measurement tools and assessments in a moment, But before we get into that, I have a question for the group. I know there are quite a few people with a lot of experience here, but for those who might be newer to it, I'd love to know what tools you've used for assessment at the pre-primary level. And if you don't have any experience with that, what tools you might have heard of before. So feel free to drop your answers in the chat. Take a look at what people have worked with previously. Okay, we see a lot of IDELA here. Great. IDELA all the way. Okay, we have an ELAM also, which is in South Africa, the AIM, ECD, the CREDI, some locally developed assessments, the ASQ. This is great. Thank you so much, everyone. It's great to hear some of these different options that people have used for measurement previously. If we can go to the next slide. All right, so the indicator peers outlines that early learning skills must be measured through an age-appropriate assessment that has satisfactory psychometric validity, reliability, and fairness, and is not subject to corruption, cheating, or score inflation. It's pretty standard language for most of our peers. Additionally, assessments should be validated in context and with the target population, which is always good practice with assessments. A quick knowledge check for you. When we say age appropriate for pre-primary education as defined by USAID, what age group are we referring to? There should be a poll that pops up. So your options are 1 to 2 years old, 3 to 6 years old, or 7 to 8 years old. Can add your guess or your knowledge if you know the answer. All right. See if we've had our answers come in. All right, the overwhelming majority of you said 3 to 6 years old, which is the correct answer. That is how we define age appropriate for pre-primary at USAID. Okay, so the peers provides illustrative examples of tools that meet the selection guidance we just described. So these include national assessments, the International Development and Early Learning Assessment, the IDELA, which it seems many of you have experience with, the Measuring Early Learning Quality and Outcomes tool, or the MELCO, or the Early Child Development Index, ECDI 2030. I want to make a very important note here, which is that the peers does not prescribe any specific tool for pre-primary measurement. The selection of tools is not limited to these examples specifically. There are other tools that have been used and validated in different contexts at the state, region, or across regional level, and those can be very relevant choices to the program or the activity. The choice of a tool will need to be guided by several considerations, including the contextual relevance and the age group that the activity is planning to reach. And it should also measure 3 of the 4 domains, which I mentioned previously. One thing to note in reporting on average learning scores is that the score will need to be reported on a scale of 0 to 100, or in other words, as a percentage. And finally, it's helpful to note that for missions who will be reporting on this in their indicator narratives, they will be required to explain which tool was used and why, including details about the validation for the context. So the disaggregates also include disaggregates for the IDELA, MELCO, or ECDI 2030. This does not mean that you have to use all of these tools in your reporting. This only means that if you're using one of these tools, you should indicate it by using the appropriate disaggregate to indicate which tool you've used in the quantitative reporting side of things. But again, the peers does not prescribe a tool to use and leaves that decision to be guided by context. All right. To help get oriented to some of these different tools, this table shows some really high-level information about the examples named in the peers. So you can see for the IDELA, the MELCO, the ECDI 2030, This table shows which age groups the tool is intended for, the domains that the tool assesses, the means of assessment or how that information is collected, and the average length of time. So you can see that these tools target slightly different age groups and use some combination of direct child assessment or caregiver report to collect that data. The tools report on many of the domains that are listed and required by the peers, but they don't always have consistent definitions of those. So for example, the executive function domain in the MELCO includes fine motor skills assessment, but doesn't include a separate physical domain. Just wanted to show a couple of additional examples of measurement tools, given that they're out there, even if they're not named in the peers specifically. So one is the ELAM in South Africa. It is a national assessment. This table includes that same information about the domains, the means of assessment, the average assessment length. And I just wanted to share some of these additional examples to, again, highlight that there are many possible options for tools to measure this indicator beyond what's mentioned in the peers. So moving forward, we wanted to look a little closer at what is actually included on some of these assessment tools as to how the domains are actually assessed. All right, we will go into this activity now. I'll read a series of questions from one of the assessment tools that we just discussed. Then you'll have a chance to guess the domain that these questions address. And we'll launch a new poll for each set of questions. So please do join in and engage. This is a great way to kind of learn a little more about what is included on these assessment tools and get a little more in-depth experience with it. So we'll move on to the first scenario. Okay. So our first scenario is the following. You have some materials, which are cards of images of circles and branches of different sizes. You would place the cards in front of the child and say, now I'm going to show you some images and ask some questions. A, look at the image and tell me which is the biggest circle. B, now tell me the smallest circle. C, look at this image. Please tell me which is the longest branch. D, tell me which is the shortest branch. So what domain do you all think this assesses? There will be a poll that pops up where you can vote. Okay, and for kind of bonus, you can enter in the chat which assessment tool you think this comes from. And we'll give you a little bit of time to vote and add in some ideas. Looks like folks are already adding in their ideas. Can we see the results from the poll? Great. Okay, so it looks like things were spread out, but the majority of folks voted for emergent numeracy, which is correct. And everyone who added their guesses in the chat was also correct. This comes from the IDELA. So as you can see, this is a way of assessing emergent numeracy through direct child assessment. If you were to assess this through a caregiver or teacher report, which other tools do, the questions might ask the respondent about how high the child can count, or if the child can give the correct number of objects upon request. So just to illustrate that there are different ways of measuring this. We'll move on to the second scenario, please. Okay, so we have two questions. Compared with children of the same age, how much does name of child kick, bite, or hit other children or adults? With some response options here. And then a second question, does the child get along well with other children, with response options? So again, there should be a poll asking which domain this assesses. And again, you can answer or add your guess to the chat about which tool this comes from. Give everyone a few moments to respond to this. Okay, it looks like there are some mixed answers in the chat. We have one vote for ECDI 2030 and IDELA, another ECDI, a MELCO, another ECDI. Can we see the responses? Yes. Okay, so we have most people responding correctly that this measures social emotional learning. That's correct. And the tool that it comes from is ECDI 2030. So again, this is an example of measuring SEL through caregiver report. There are ways of measuring this through direct child assessment, which might look like asking children to talk about their friends, how they respond to feeling happy, how they respond to feeling sad, what they do to make themselves feel better, questions along those lines. All right, we'll move on to assessment scenario 3. Okay, so we have 3 questions here. Can the child communicate his or her own needs or what she wants in a way that is understandable to peers? Can the child understand on the first try what is being said to him or her? Would you say that the child is interested in reading? So again, what domain are we assessing here? Take some time to respond, and you can add in your guesses about which tool this comes from. I'll give it a few moments. All right, we have a guess of the IDELA, the ECDI, the MELCO. All right, maybe we'll share the responses now. So there was a little bit of a spread, but language and emergent literacy is the correct response. This is assessing language and emergent literacy, and it does come from the MELCO. So we have one more assessment scenario, and let's move on to that one. I think if you've been following along, you'll note that there are 4 domains and 4 assessment scenarios, and 1 left. All right, so the assessment scenario here is touch your head, touch your toes, touch your head, touch your toes, touch your knees, touch your shoulders. So this one is probably pretty obvious, but which domain does this one assess? And again, you can take a guess as to which assessment tool this comes from. We can share the responses. We've got some guesses for the IDELA. Great. It looks like everyone got it right. We had physical development as our final option, and a note that this also measures executive functioning. Great. Yeah, so this measures physical development, and it actually comes from the AIM ECD. So in this particular scenario, a caregiver, or in a different scenario, a caregiver report, the respondent might be asked how high a child can jump, and if they can write their name on paper to assess fine motor skills. So I'll hand it over now to my colleague Suzanne Zeidema, who is a member of our inclusive education team, to talk about some of the disaggregates.
Great. Thank you very much, Anne. As she said, I'm Suzanne Zeidema. I'm a senior inclusive education advisor at USAID Center for Education, and I'm going to walk you through a brief overview of the numerous disaggregates for this new indicator. Disaggregates are really useful for reporting because they can capture information about groups that are often marginalized and excluded from services. And they can also show if an activity is meeting the needs of all learners by tracking progress over time. So this new pre-primary indicator has the following disaggregate groups. There's gender, disability, developmental domains split out individually, the total number of learners reached, and then the assessment tools. And again, as has been noted numerous times before, these assessment tools are illustrative, they are not mandatory. If you look at the disaggregate codes there, you'll see a lowercase letter after each one, and that shows you which specific disaggregate you are reporting on. I want to note here that the ES 1.1-1 does not have a disaggregate requirement for age, But it is important to keep in mind that the pre-primary age group does cover children 3 to 6, and this age group is characterized by rapid and nonlinear development. And things like a child's age, disability status, and culture also can impact developmental progress. We also know that differentiating by age, not differentiating by age, may result in misleading conclusions when you have this average score, because of course, for example, the average skill level of a 3-year-old is quite different than the average skill level of a 6-year-old. So the PERS guidance encourages mission staff and implementing partners to adopt monitoring and assessment approaches that accurately reflect age-appropriate developmental expectations. And there is some guidance on how to go about accounting for age differences. Excuse me. But before moving on to the disability disaggregate, which I want to discuss in detail, I do want to flag an important distinction in terminology between age-appropriate and developmentally appropriate. So because we're talking about tools, they of course have to be reported by age level. But age-appropriate might not be taking into account things like a child or a group's ability levels. For example, a child with a disability may have different developmental skills than are age-appropriate. So it is still a challenge for us at this age group in making clear that distinction in our reporting, and we do look forward to hearing from people who are using this indicator, how they are able to measure and report progress for all learners. So I want to just give a little bit of guidance about the disability disaggregate, because reporting on disability is required for all learning outcome indicators, including this one at the pre-primary level. And who are we talking about when we're reporting on the disability disaggregate? So USAID adheres to the definition of disability as found in the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the CRPD, which states that people with disabilities include those who have long-term physical, mental, intellectual, or sensory impairments, which, in interaction with various barriers, may hinder their full and effective participation in society on an equal basis with others. This disaggregate is defined as the average early learning skill score for pre-primary learners with disabilities targeted for USG assistance. And this disaggregate is useful in a number of ways. First of all, it is meeting our reporting requirements for USAID activities. Secondly, it is showing you that the average change in skills development over time for learners with disabilities as a group. And lastly, it amplifies the importance of collecting data about learners with disabilities. But I also want to clarify what this disability disaggregate does not do. So first of all, it is not reporting on individual learners. Even though this disaggregate is taken from the larger data collection pool, it is still an average learner for all learners with disabilities in your program. Secondly, it doesn't show what's working or what's not specifically in an activity design. So while you may see progress in learners with disabilities average score over time, it doesn't tell you exactly what's working or what's not. You'd still need to go back to your individual assessments or formative assessments or whatever you're doing in the learning space to look at individual learners to see if they are making progress over time. And lastly, and this is quite important, this disability disaggregate is not identifying individual learners as having a disability. There's no cutoff score for this assessment process that signals a learner may have a developmental delay or a disability. The learners who are represented in this disability disaggregate have already been identified previously through a different screening and evaluation process as having a disability or a developmental delay prior to this process. And programs may have and use different screening processes or prevalence tools to identify children who may have disabilities, and that's outside the scope of this indicator. So we recognize that this is an issue because very often at this age group, children have not been previously identified. So I do want to point out that this disability disaggregate may be underrepresenting learners in your programs that have a disability, and it's worth looking at your screening and evaluation processes to make sure learners are identified. So that was a very quick overview of the disaggregates, and I'm happy to answer any questions we have later. And I will turn it back over to Cassandra from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Suzanne, and thank you. And that was really great. And I see that we have some questions. But before we get to the questions that were shared today and also ahead of this webinar, I wanted to share again that this is a very exciting time for the agency, but we also understand that and recognize that for some USAID operating units, as well as our implementing partners, we might need 1 or few years to transition to being able to report on this indicator. So we encourage operating units as well as our implementing partners to work really closely, and for implementing partners to reach out to your AOR or COR so you can plan for transition into this indicator. That is the same also if you have been using one of the 2 supplemental indicators that ES 1.1-1 is replacing. So I went through the chat. Many thanks for all your participation. There was a question specific that I think was asked twice around whether there is a requirement that the tool identified cover the domains, but does not need to report separate scores on each of the domains. So in the disaggregate, and I'll pass it to Ans, you can maybe explain it further, but in the disaggregate table, we do request the score, the average score for each of the domains. And that is because we understand the importance of having that information for programmatic purposes. We also understand that some of the tools that have been used and that have been validated globally, including one of the ones that we're providing as an example, might not provide this information at each of the domains. The implementation guidance tell us that programs need to support at least 3 of the 4 domains. And we understand, though, that all the tools might not be able to help in the second part of this requirement. But if that is the case, we invite our operating unit to provide this information in what is called the indicator narrative. It's a piece of information that is going to be very important because that's where we ask for information shared on the selection of the tool, how it was validated, and if the tool does not provide this information by domain, why it was still selected as one of the tools. But again, in the disaggregate table, we request for those information as we understand that information is what is also very useful for programmatic purposes. And do you want to share something else on this?
I think that covers a lot of it, Cassandra. I'll just add that having that information disaggregated by domain is just a useful piece of information to know what is incorporated in the programming of those 4 domains that are required by the implementation policy. So it's kind of just a way to get additional information about that piece of things, and not necessarily a requirement in terms of prescriptive accountability, just a way to know what is included in that assessment. I think that's all.
Thank you, Anne. Okay, so we do have also a list of questions that we received ahead of this webinar. Thank you for those that have shared those. There was one question around whether there was flexibility in choosing the domains to measure and those not to measure, especially in emergency context. And the ES 1.1-1 does provide some flexibility, but also provides clear guidance on reporting on domains. And this is something that Anne shared. So we know the activity should target, measure, and report, depending on the tool selected, at least 3 of the 4 domains identified in the peers, the ones that Anne presented today. Again, those are language, emergent literacy, emergent numeracy, cell, and physical development. And the implementation guidance and the peers also provide information that although your activity might be address additional domains, those additional domains should not be among the 3 that you're reporting on. So the choice of the 3 domains still needs to be among the 4 that we have been discussing today. So that is some of the flexibility that is provided. Luckily, as we discussed today, most of the early developmental and learning tools that you might end up selecting do measure these 4 domains, and most also do report on the 4 domains, although they might be using different terminology or as Anne also presented today. Again, this is a starting point for us as an agency. We're very excited that we can start reporting on learning outcomes, but we're also very excited to start seeing and learning from the experiences of our operating units and implementing partners. So we hope that as the new indicator is adopted and used, we start gaining a better understanding of the different tools that are available in supporting measurement in different contexts, including those that are really useful for programmatic purposes in contexts they're experiencing crisis and conflict. Sorry, that was one of the questions we received, and I hope that was helpful, but if not, please let me know in the chat. And then we discussed how this is a starting point. ES 1.1-1 is very new. We only included it among standard indicators from this fiscal year, from fiscal year 2024. So we also understand that some operating units might not be able to already provide the average score. So they might be inputting targets on average scores. And we have received some questions on how to go about setting targets for average scores. So maybe, Anne, can I ask you to address that question?
Certainly. Thank you, Cassandra. So in terms of setting targets, because this is a new indicator for USAID, there isn't a lot of historical target data to look at. And this might be a different process for our operating units and for implementing partners working together. But some ways to start this process, this obviously will differ from context to context. And as much as possible, we recommend doing research within your context about, first of all, gains in the emergent skills of interest in these 4 domains. What does that look like? How has that been measured in the past? And while you're doing so, there's a few considerations to keep in mind, which includes gains among different age groups, and then different learner groups of interests, as well as the time frame for your activity. So you might target a different average level of learning score for a program that's working for 1 year as compared to one that's working for 5 years, and depending on how you have set up your data collection. You'll also want to try to find data collection in your context using the tool that you're proposing to use for measurement of this indicator. If there has been any information collected using that tool, you can use that to contextualize the targets that you're aiming to set and inform what that expected change might look like for your particular program. If you're not able to find any information about change in learning scores using the tool that you would like to use, you can look just to see what else has been used to measure that change in emergent learning, and see how you might be able to apply that to the tool that you're looking to use, or you might decide to change which tool you're going to use to be able to set those targets as well. Again, it depends on the context and what is sort of realistic in the environment that you're working in. Again, it's important to think about your goals with existing contextual data, thinking through how much progress seems feasible within the time frame that you're hoping to work in, and in the context that you're working in, and making sure that everything is relevant, but still kind of an appropriate push for measuring learning. And as we've highlighted in this webinar quite often, this is a new indicator for us. So setting targets also is a new process for this particular indicator. And we really do hope that you all will share your experiences in doing that, what has worked well, what has been challenging to do in target setting, and really share that back with us so that we can offer additional resources and guidance for folks who are looking to do that for the first time. But in the meantime, set ambitious but appropriate targets for our programming moving forward with this indicator.
That was great. Thank you, Anne. I'm looking at the chat and I see there are a few questions around tools. I see Aisha specifically is asking whether we can select and use tools in all environments or whether they need to be standardized and adapted. So the examples that we provide are examples of tools that have been used across different countries and contexts, and they're just examples. So we're really counting on operating units, working with implementing partners on identifying a tool that can be used in their context. And in our presentation, share some of the criteria for the selection of the tools, and those are included in the peers. So you'll be able to find it there as well. But we will request that whatever the tool is, the one that is identified to report in a specific context for a specific activity, that we have some information on whether it has been adapted and validated in the specific context in which it's being used. I hope that answered your question, Aisha. But again, the tools that we have provided as example have been used across different contexts. They've been validated across different contexts as well. But there might be tools that have been developed and used only in a specific country, as the example from South Africa that we provided today. So we do provide the guidance on the criteria to be used for the selection, and then the information should be shared by the operating units in these reporting and what we call the indicator narrative. So all of this to say is that the choice really guided by the context, whether or not there are tools that are already being used. There might be a tool that the local, the national ministry that you're working with might have been using. But please do feel comfortable in having this conversation with your USAID counterparts on what tools would be best to use. I hope that answers your question. I see another question around guidance, around sampling and data collection timeframes. So we are working on a set of guidance and supporting documents for the use of the indicator. We have a strong understanding that we do need to provide information on what we have included in the peers. So I cannot say yes, but we probably will be looking at also additional guidance on sampling as possible. But again, we understand there is a lot of existing expertise among implementing partners and other partners. So we look also to you all. If you have already existing tools, we wouldn't want to replicate things that have already been developed and found useful. I don't see other questions, but if you do have questions, please do send those to us, as well as observation and as well as recommendations. Again, this is a fairly new area for us as an agency, and we're very excited and acknowledge that there has been a lot of things that happened before the USAID 2018 education policy in the pre-primary space. So please do reach out. I will pass it on now to Melissa for some closing remarks, and thank you. Melissa, to you.
Thank you, Cassandra. Thank you, Anne and Suzanne. Thanks really for the detailed and very informed overview. And thanks for all the great questions from the participants. And really, thanks everyone for joining us today. And before we say goodbye, I just wanted to share 2 invitations with you. First, immediate invitation to USA colleagues for the current fiscal year reporting. Please share targets for out years, or even just indicate in the indicator narrative that the operating unit is working to establish baseline and targets and identify a relevant assessment tool. So that will help us, I think, get the indicator going, learn from previous out years. And that will be reported in a future reporting cycle. Second, an invitation to USAID implementing partners to continue working with us and help us build evidence on early learning alongside other local and international stakeholders. We recognize and value the expertise you bring to this space and look forward to continuing to learn together. So thanks everyone. Have a wonderful day. And we look forward to working with you on this important indicator and reporting.